was Johnny Papalia. What was he like?
Just cold. That's all I can say.
The best way I can describe Johnny Pops Papalia was this guy used to love to scare people.
While Canadian crime figures aren't quite as well known as American mafiosos, there are some memorable Canadian mobsters worth your attention. In today's video, we'll go through the life of Johnny Joseph Papalia, the most dominant boss of the Hamilton-based Papalia Crime Family. He was Johnny Pops to those who loved him. However, the majority that feared his legacy preferred the name Johnny the Enforcer. To put him into perspective, one judge once quoted that the fear of Papalia seemed to be greater than the fear of God. Not only will we discuss his personal life, but we'll also explain how he structured his businesses to emerge as one of North America's longest serving mafiosos. Born on March 18, 1924 in Hamilton to Mafia parents, Johnny was pretty much destined for a life of crime. He was one of 7 sons that looked up to their bootlegger father. According to Johnny, it was incredible how their dad, an immigrant who couldn't even read or write, was able to put food on the table and own a car. He wanted a life just like that. Through his teenage years, Papalia would grow into a gangster prodigy. Despite his smallish 5'8" frame, he was always ready for a brawl. He was a wild kid who enjoyed staging burglaries in the neighborhood with his gang of delinquents. Apparently, he was also good enough with the ladies to acquire syphilis by the age of 19. It didn't take much to anger Papalia. According to those close to him, he didn't like that he was born out of wedlock. Those who were dumb enough to even jokingly call him a bastard often faced a brutal beating. Johnny also shared a similar hatred for the Canadian government that once falsely accused and imprisoned his father for supporting Mussolini's fascist regime. Even though his father was later released, the damage was already done. Papalia didn't want anything to do with the government, and despite being of age, refused to volunteer in the Second World War. Instead, in 1943, he moved to Toronto, joined a gang, and became a professional burglar. Johnny's first professional gang featured the likes of Paul Volpe, the Pascal brothers, and Alberto. Life in Toronto was as wild as young Papalia had hoped. They did everything from robbing banks and convenience stores to selling drugs. In fact, they even partnered with Harvey Chernak, one of Toronto's biggest heroin dealers. Other underworld associates confirmed that it was a very tough bunch. They specified that even though Papalia himself wasn't all that scary, he surrounded himself with people who could do a lot of damage. Unfortunately for him, the young and upcoming gangster would experience his first arrest on January 27, 1944, for failing to register for the Canadian Army. However, after considering his persistent health issues and criminal tendencies, the government decided to drop the charges and release Papalia. Unknown to them, only several weeks later, the gang would rob a Toronto Dominion bank. Many experts believe it was this heist that provided Papalia with the funds needed to launch his criminal enterprises. After making it big, Papalia would always jokingly refer to that particular branch as our bank. In 1945, Papalia was again arrested facing burglary charges. Fortunately, the jury served a favorable short sentence. 4 years later, in 1949, he faced more serious charges after he was arrested for possession of narcotics with the intention to sell. At his trial, Johnny remorsefully explained that he wasn't selling heroin as his prosecutors claimed. Rather, he maintained that he needed the drug to treat his syphilis-related pain. It worked. The judge sympathized with the young man and handed him a much shorter sentence of 2 years in Gulf Reformatory. Meanwhile, the Crown tried to strike a deal with the 25-year-old gangster. They promised to reduce his sentence if he would feed them information about the growing heroin business. Papalia stubbornly turned down the offer, and it paid off. This seriously boosted his reputation in the underworld, and higher-ups now knew they could count on him. Immediately after his release in 1951, Johnny moved to Montreal after being summoned by Luigi Greco and Carmen, the representative of the Musitano Crime Family. Carmen was so heavily impressed by Johnny's conduct and work ethic that he introduced him to Vincenzo Cortoni, the boss of Montreal's Cortoni crime family. He even appointed Papalia as his agent in Ontario. From 1954 to 1955, Johnny did several jobs for the Mafia, from running taxi companies to collecting money from businesses. Eventually, Montreal proved to be too much for the young criminal, and he moved back to Toronto after surviving an assassination attempt. Sometime in 1955, Johnny's long life of crime that almost cost him his life finally paid off. He was summoned to appear before Stefano, the boss of the powerful Buffalo crime family. Quickly, he was inducted as a made man into the organization and appointed to be the boss of the Papalia family in Ontario. Papalia knew the life of petty crimes was now behind him. The young burglar was now the head of a well-structured criminal organization based in Hamilton. He knew it was a chance to grasp power and wealth, and so he did. As if to warn him, Stefano explained to Papalia that he wasn't to replace the old leaders in Ontario. Instead, he is to work with the Dons, listen to their advice, and enforce the will of the Buffalo crime family. Papalia's territory spread from Hamilton to Burlington, Oakville, St. Catharines, and Niagara Falls. He also had some influence in northern Ontario into North Bay. To say Johnny Papalia was rich is an understatement. With his newfound status and reputation, the young Don seized several businesses in his territory. His method of conquest was quite simple. Johnny would simply walk up to a business owner and ask, "Johnny Papalia, does that mean anything to you?" When the owner said no, he would casually introduce himself as a new business partner. Any further resistance was quickly met with violence courtesy of his thugs. What about the police? Well, with the backing of a powerful organization such as the Buffalo Crime Family, even justice didn't stand a chance. Just like that, Papalia had tens of small to medium-sized businesses paying him up to $1,000 a week for protection services. Like a shrewd businessman, Johnny would then invest his protection income into his loan sharking business, which he also called shylocking. Like others in the trade at the time, he enlisted the services of Howard Chord, a monster of a man with a scarred face that haunted anybody who looked him in the eyes. His resume was quite impressive for the job. He was a professional heavyweight boxer, and even though he had never won any mainstream titles, he did win the Kingston Penitentiary boxing tournament. The loan sharking business was an instant moneymaker. He targeted desperate businessmen and offered them hefty loans at the drop of a hat. He cleverly marketed his offers, reassuring his loanees that they only needed to pay him $6 for every $5 lent for 2 weeks. Unknown to his clients, that would amount to the extremely high annual interest rates of up to 1,040%. If for any reason someone failed to settle his debt, Johnny would send his thugs to convince the defaulter. Slowly, Papalia's loan sharks broke into Toronto's and Hamilton's lucrative gambling clubs. At this point, Johnny wasn't even loaning out his money. He partnered with other mafiosos who allowed him to borrow their cash, loan it out, and return with double the interest. Other dons backed the idea because not only did they earn tax-free income, they were also assured Papalia's men would always return with their money. A pimp once tried to outsmart Papalia's goons of $1,000. Quickly, Howard and his crew arrived at the scene and convinced him to sign over his $5,000 convertible. The car was then immediately sold to a mafioso associate for $3,000, and just like that, they had made $2,000 profit. Another Winnipeg hotel owner lost $36,000 to a Toronto bookmaker. As if on cue, two strongmen went to visit him, and before the meeting was over, he had signed 260 checks, post-dated a week apart, for $300 each, a total of $78,000. It was also around the same time that the Papalia family bought the Monarch Vending Company. Even though Frank was listed as the owner and manager, everyone in Hamilton knew who was really in charge. Monarch Vending grew into a monopoly like none other. No other company was willing to compete with it. First, because they couldn't. Second, no one wanted to go head-to-head with the upcoming Papalia Crime Family. Businessmen who couldn't settle their debts were forced to set up vending machines on their premises. To be clear, Monarch Vending made as much as $12,000 in daily profit. How did he manage to make so much money off of his vending machines? Well, according to police reports, Papalia had stolen most of the cigarettes he sold in his vending machines. It started with warehouse raids, and before long, they were intercepting cigarette trucks and railway cars. The provincial inspector at the time told the public that Papalia had 3 organized rings responsible for the operations. In just 8 months, they would steal roughly 1.5 tons of cigarettes and distribute them across hundreds of underworld vending machines. Speaking of organized rings, Johnny also found a way of squeezing millions from churches and charity organizations. In 1957, a small Toronto company called Esquire Novelty offered cheaper bingo cards to churches and service clubs. Whereas a bingo card would normally cost $250 per $1,000 of potential prizes, Esquire Novelty sold theirs for only $1 per 1,000. However, unknown to the churches and clubs, Esquire would then send a man under an alias to town, The man would check in at the local hotel and organize for 3 locals to go to the games with printing presses. As the winning numbers were read up, the locals would print them onto identical cards and claim the prizes. The man would then later meet up with them, take the prizes, and pay them anywhere from $20 to $100 for their work. Now, bingo games were more popular then than they are now. Even on a bad night, there would be at least $15,000 in prizes. In such a case, besides making money from the sale of cards, Esquire Novelty would make away with at least $14,000 in prizes. Investigators later revealed that in the 4 years that Esquire organized bingo events for Lions Club in Toronto, the club only made $30,000 in profit. On the other hand, Esquire made $100,000 from the sale of cards and an additional $96,000 in prizes. It's even crazier if you take into account that Papalia's men were doing this across 8 provinces, duping hundreds of churches and clubs. Authorities estimated that the company made away with roughly $6 million a year. By 1958, Papalia was rolling in money. He was known for his classy, expensive suits and automobiles that only reaffirmed his womanizing habits. Those close to him recalled that he loved flashing $50 and $100 bills as a sign of his wealth. In his own words, they were his reds and browns. Unfortunately for him, you can only shine so bright without attracting unwanted attention. The authorities were slowly but surely catching up with him. After several police raids on his gambling clubs, he decided to further diversify his income. Johnny Papalia now decided it was time to go big or go home. In October of the same year, with Stefano's permission, he contacted Vincent and Frank Caruso of the Genovese crime family and declared that he wanted in on the heroin business. Papalia's plan was to smuggle heroin into the US and wanted someone on the inside who could distribute and sell his products. The following year, in 1959, Papalia was invited to a secret meeting in New York City. Experts believe it's the same iconic meeting that set up the infamous French Connection smuggling network. According to the police informants, Papalia was the only Canadian invited to the meeting and was introduced to the rest as the capo that ruled Southern Ontario on behalf of the Buffalo crime family. The French Connection was no joke. Just to fill you in, the smuggling ring was responsible for supplying over 80% of America's heroin market from the 1960s to 70s. The MAFIA brought in tons of heroin via France into North America. International authorities on the case explained that the drug was grown in the poppy fields of Turkey, the Golden Crescent Nations, and the Golden Triangle Nations. One can only imagine just how much money Papalia made from this operation. Nevertheless, even with all that drug money, Papalia still wished to dominate Toronto's lucrative gambling business. After all, he had the power and connections within the police force to make that happen. Unfortunately, there was one man standing in his way. Maxime Bluestein was pretty much the king of Toronto's legal gambling scene, and somehow had managed to keep the mafia out of his pocket. Besides his Lakeview club, which raked in more than $13 million annually, he was also the proud owner of a series of rental apartments in the neighborhood and a finance company. He was a rich man that didn't hold back as far as bragging is concerned. On March 21st, 1961, Johnny spotted Bluestein at the local tavern and sent him a drink. This wasn't just any approach. To accept the drink meant submission and willingness to partner with the mafia. Owing to his pride and unaware that he was completely outnumbered, Bluestein firmly turned down the offer, arrogantly saying if some punk wanted to talk to him, he should come to his table. Tensions continued to rise as time passed by, and after drinking a little more than he should have, Bluestein got carried away in his narrative. Confidently, he assured his entourage to leave him behind so he could handle these punks. After staggering to Papalia's area, he was kindly invited into the lounge, an offer he again turned down. In the blink of an eye, 2 men suddenly appeared behind him and struck him in the head with a blackjack. To defend himself, Bluestein pulled out his pocket knife and stabbed his attacker, but it was too late. What followed can only be best described as a semi-execution. A local columnist that covered the story commented that it was as terrible a beating as it was possible to give a man without killing him. Bluestein was beaten with fists, brass knuckles, blackjacks, and iron bars. According to columnist Burton's account, Bluestein's cheekbones were smashed, his scalp was split at least 8 times, knuckle dusters were smashed into his eyes, and a broken bottle ground into his mouth. 10 days later, when he went to visit the businessman, he looked like a piece of meat. Surprisingly, when the police arrived at the scene, no one told him what happened, despite the fact the incident had taken place in plain sight. Authorities stated that it was the most remarkable case of mass blindness in Canadian history. No one was willing to cooperate. Despite knowing who he was up against, Burton was determined to bring Papalia to justice. Slowly, his inquisition paid off and the public supported him. The attention ended up being too much for the Papalia family and associates. Their boss was forced to turn himself in. During the trial, over 100 witnesses refused to testify against Johnny Papalia. The fear in their eyes was visible for everyone to see, including the jury. The mafia boss was guilty and sentenced to 18 months in prison for assault. With Papalia behind bars, more reporters and columnists brought to light more about the mafioso's dealings. Peter's profile of the gangster explained that Johnny Papalia's dream was to become Canada's Al Capone. Additionally, he also wrote about Johnny's alleged sex addiction and how he was a compulsive womanizer who loved sleeping with other men's girlfriends and wives. Apparently, he even did this to his own thugs, and it wasn't rare for him to order them to allow to sleep with their partners. Understandably, this was one of the many reasons Papalia was commonly hated by those around him. Even after the beating, Bluestein still maintained his control over the Toronto gambling market. Unfortunately, the damage was already dealt. The beating must have had a psychological effect because not long after, he started suffering intense paranoia. Later in 1973, he was enlisted into a mental institution after killing his own friend. Eventually, Bluestein died of a heart attack. The Bloody Bluestein incident was the start for Papalia's problems. A few months after his trial, in July 1963, he was ordered to be extradited to the United States. The law had finally caught up with him, and he was to be tried for his role in the French Connection drug smuggling ring. As he was deported to a foreign country, Johnny could be heard shouting to the reports, "I'm being kidnapped, help me, they're taking me somewhere I don't want to go." According to the Attorney General of the United States at the time, Robert F. Kennedy, the French Connection case was the deepest penetration ever made in the illegal international trafficking of drugs. Surprisingly, Johnny pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Also far away in Italy, the Canadian mobster was sentenced in his absence to 10 years in prison for gangsterism. The sentence was the main reason Papalia never set foot in Italy despite his family operating in the region. Back home, the Buffalo crime family didn't waste any time replacing Johnny. Stefano promoted Sabetta to the role of representative of the Buffalo family in Ontario. On January 25, 1968, after serving less than half his sentence, Papalia was released and sent back to Canada. His arrival was celebrated by many of Hamilton's underworld figures as they lined up their Lincolns and Cadillacs on Railway Street to show support. Much to his annoyance, his treasure Toronto had been passed down by Stefano to his longtime associate Paul Volpe. He met with Giacomo Lupino and tried to convince him to return the asset. The Buffalo agent refused. However, he did tell Johnny the organization had much work for him to do in Toronto. In the following weeks, Papalia met with Lupino a lot, and every time they met, the police would find a bullet-ridden body somewhere in an alley. The cases increased as the organization took out the trash, including some former associates that had gone rogue. It was also around this time that he officially got the name The Enforcer. After the chain killings in the 70s, more police forces worked harder to pin the Hamilton boss. They employed more informants and bugs to try and find incriminating evidence. As a result, into the late 70s and early 80s, Papalia took more of a backseat in the underworld dealings. He was getting older, and because of his lifelong tuberculosis, he knew he wouldn't survive another prison sentence. In January 1981, he married Janetta Hayes in a private ceremony and decided to focus his attention on more legal businesses. He invested in beer magic dispensers and FM Amusements pinball machines that brought him even more money. After Volpe's death in November 1983, Stefano once again reinstated Papalia as a representative in Southern Ontario. However, this time he resigned to more of a godfather figure. Even the old people in the neighborhood referred to him as Godfather. Even though the Railway Street locals knew about his dark past, many that interacted with him testified that he was kind to them. According to reports, he was good to kids and would offer jobs to people in need of money. He looked after them. Still, with the police on his back, Papalia was careful who he interacted with. Nonetheless, he still ran Southern Ontario quite efficiently and was known for using hand gestures to issue his orders. A reporter once asked old Papalia why he was always surrounded by gangsters. Jokingly, he replied that he attended a lot of Italian weddings, and you get to meet a lot of people at Italian weddings. However, if there were people he didn't like, they were bikers. In his own words, Papalia described them as intolerably stupid and crude. He didn't want any of them to ever set foot in Ontario, much less Hamilton. Even though he tolerated Satan's Choice bikers, he particularly detested Hells Angels. In fact, Johnny Papalia's presence through the 80s and 90s was the main reason why Walter Stadnick's Hells Angels wouldn't dare establish themselves in Ontario. He had a shoot-on-sight policy for bikers. Unfortunately for him, his reign would end much sooner than anticipated. It wasn't bikers that took him out. You see, unknown to the Hamilton mafioso, the upcoming Musitano crime family was out for his head. Besides craving his throne, they also owed him $250,000 that they weren't willing to repay. The Musitano brothers knew they couldn't dare lay a hand on Buffalo's made man without fearing retaliation. Therefore, they arranged for a meeting with an equally capable Montreal crime family, the Rizzutos. The Rizzutos agreed to offer them protection because they themselves wanted to expand into Ontario. Finally, on May 31st, 1997, 73-year-old Johnny Papalia found himself standing in his parking lot with a cocked gun aimed at the back of his head. A loud bang was the last sound he heard. Police investigators later found out that Kenneth Murdock was the hitman for the job. Apparently, that wasn't their first meeting at the parking lot. Murdock had repeatedly approached Papalia asking for help. He owed the Musitanos a lot of money and hoped the Hamilton boss would help him out. On that day, Papalia again refused his request, saying it wasn't his problem, and turned around to enter his vehicle. Around 2 months later, it was the same Murdock that also took out Carmen, Johnny's right-hand man. Papalia was buried weeks later. With the head of the Papalias gone, the Musitano crime family tightened its hold on Ontario. Love or hate him, no one can deny that Papalia was an important figure in Hamilton's underworld. One gang expert commented that they don't make guys like him anymore. He further stated that it's difficult for most people to comprehend just how powerful Johnny was. Remember, he was the only Canadian figure to sit at the same table as the most powerful figures in New York City. Without a doubt, Johnny Papalia played a massive part in shaping Ontario's mafioso into what it is today. To date, the Papalia crime family still exists in Hamilton, Italy, and even Australia. According to authorities, even though it's not as powerful, its members are still in charge of millions of dollars made from the international French Connection smuggling ring. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this in the future. Also comment down below letting me know what you'd like to see next. Thanks for watching and have a good one.